considered in this tradition, and but I think I'll handle them just in the introduction on who are the Cynics, because there's not as much rich and interesting stuff about them as for Diogenes of Sinope, who's, there's also a controversy. Well, I'll go ahead and start. When it comes to ancient cynicism, one of the main controversies is what it is and who it starts with. So Diogenes of Sinope is the one who claims the title of the dog, and doggedness is the etymology of cynicism. However, quite with Antisthenes, who was a supreme. I've done a lot of that convinces me that there's continuity between the two, and I find no reason to doubt the teacher to pupil relationship between Antisthenes and Diogenes, although Diogenes definitely acted out his philosophy in a way that Antisthenes never did.
Can you give us dates on Antisthenes?
Dates on Antisthenes.
Yeah.
He's roughly 445 BCE to 365 CE. And then, in the introduction, I will talk about 3 places in Antisthenes where one might see interest in money. 2 of them are passages in Xenophon, so this might overlap with the Xenophon person, and it's tricky to know whether the interest in money comes from Antisthenes or from Xenophon. But one passage in the Memorabilia where Antisthenes and Socrates discuss the value of buying friends, and Antisthenes' main point seems to be that friends can't be bought, friends are priceless, and they're outside the monetization, if you will, and who knows why Xenophon or Socrates even brings up monetizing the acquisition of friends. And then the second one is in his long speech in the Symposium, where he talks about his simple life, and the goal of his simple life, which avoids making money, is to stay out of the marketplace of the tyrannical personalities pursuing endless luxury, and preserve leisure to spend time with Socrates. And then the third place in Antisthenes, which is really just a book title, but has been used by at least one writer on Antisthenes as the core of a section on Antisthenes and money, is Midas, Heracles or Midas, and the Midas myth of everything you touch turning to gold is used as a rejection of monetization. Crates of Thebes, Diogenes' famous disciple, is certainly a philosopher with if there's a capital P involved in ancient philosophy, he's closer than Diogenes or than Diogenes. He's accredited with being the teacher of Zeno of Sinope, and so he's studied with. Well, he's no one disputes that he's part of the ancient philosophical tradition, whereas, and the same goes for Antisthenes, whereas Diogenes is sort of the odd man out there. And Crates of Thebes was famously born into a wealthy family of Thebes and threw all his money away because money was a hindrance to the pursuit of virtue and of the true meaning of life. So those are the 3 that's framing Diogenes for us. And if anyone has further questions about what ancient cynicism is or the times we're talking about, ancient cynicism is an urban phenomenon, so that's key to my whole take here, and it flourishes in classical Athens, and it flourishes with Diogenes of Sinope because he came from one city that was like classical Athens to another that was classical Athens, where he was not a citizen, and Crates of Thebes was from Corinth. Cynicism dies off a little bit in the early Hellenistic period and maybe gets taken over by Stoicism, but then it comes back under the Roman Empire, where Alexandria and Rome are sites of the Cynics. But the Cynics need an audience. The Cynic mission is to convert fellow humans to the pursuit of reason. Diogenes' message is you need reason or a nous. So the goal of all the antics of the Cynics is to call people to a well-valued life, which has to do with goods of the mind and not external luxury-based goods. So the Cynics also privilege independence or self-determination, autocracy, or what is
Monarchy.
autarky, sorry, yes. And so there's a lot of tension in cynicism, because if the mission of the Cynic were accomplished, there would be no cynicism, because the Cynics need an audience and a city. So when we come to Diogenes' Politeia, that becomes relevant in how we interpret the details of what he does there, an ideal city. So the sources on ancient cynicism are notoriously difficult. We're dealing with so Diogenes of Sinope is alleged to have written a lot of texts, possibly 12 or 13 titles, including dialogues, epistles, and tragedies. Diogenes Laertius, who's our main biographical source on Diogenes of Sinope, already tells us about ancient disputes about whether any of his writings were genuine or parts of them were genuine. No quotations from his writings survive, and it's sort of modern scholars conveniently to say he wrote nothing and his whole persona is lore. But what we have is lore and a lot of very brief anecdotes about his behaviors, and a lot of it outrageous. Since 1926, scholars have focused on the lore in Diogenes Laertius, book 6, as the core of the being of Diogenes of Sinope. I think that there's a lot more evidence reflected in the pseudo-epistles of Diogenes, in Epictetus, in Diochrysostom, but those, for today, I'll be mostly talking about Diogenes Laertius. He's our main transmitter of the changed currency story. Philodemus's fragmentary text preserved on papyrus is the source of most of what we know about Diogenes Laertius's constitution or politeia republic. The actual evidence for what we're going to talk about is very slim, and it becomes a matter of interpreting vocabulary, interpreting the context in which Diogenes is responding, and in terms of what we say in this volume, I very much want it to fit with whatever story we're telling in the volume. I'd like to see Diogenes as the first critic of monetization and someone who first tries to push us back to a more real good-based economy of exchange and relationships. But he also seems to take for granted monetization and want people just to do it right, to do it better. So I look forward to any responses from you on those big picture issues. So I'll go now into the 3 substantial areas of story for Diogenes that seem to be especially relevant, starting with the story that he changed the currency of Sinope. So we have no fewer than 6 versions of the story, all at the very beginning of Diogenes Laertius's account. And they're put there to explain how Diogenes got converted to philosophy. And they also sort of cover so Diogenes Laertius starts with everybody's birthplace, their parents, and how they got converted to philosophy. So this story seems to take care of all that for Diogenes of Sinope, but it's a much bigger story than any other philosopher gets for that topic in Diogenes Laertius. So according to some versions of the story, I won't go through all of them. I think that's tedious classicist stuff. But if people know the versions or have questions about the versions, certainly we can go further into that or think that whatever level of detail is appropriate here. According to one version, his father was a banker. His name was Hicasias, and Hicasias either Hicasias. I guess I'll just conflate the versions. Himself. Defaced, so restamped, so karato, the origin of our word character originally means to stamp coins. So that verb karasin has a prefix para karasin. So he stamped on the side, he unstamped it, he restamped it, he revised the stamping of the currency. And for that reason, either he went to jail and was executed, whereas his son fled, or they both fled, or in some of the versions. Diogenes himself did the process, but he had to be sent into exile because of this. In the more punitive versions of the account, he also debased the currency, so he made it kibulos, or he defaced the value of the currency. And I don't know, some of you might be able to advise on whether, I take it there's no reference to the metallic content of the currency. It's all about the stamping and the authorization of the currency. But that second word does often refer to a counterfeit, debased currency, I guess, that doesn't have the right metallic value. Yes.
It could mean mixing cheap metals in with the precious metals, reducing the silver percentage.
That's what it should mean. In this case, it seems to have to do with a change of authority in Sinope. And I don't know enough about the actual coins of, so people have wanted to tie this to the history of Sinope, this story. And I've been skeptical of that, but looking at it now, I think I am sympathetic, but I want to take a special angle on how that story gets told. So what happens is, so Sinope in the mid-5th century, before Diogenes, around the time of Pericles in the 440s, is under a tyranny. Pericles goes in and sends his guy Cimon in to kick out the tyrant. And they then send 600 settlers from Athens to take over the lands of the tyrants. This would be either the grandfather generation of Diogenes or the probably the grandfather's generation of Diogenes. And then the Sinopeans from the 440s to 375, so for a good 60 years or so, happily govern their area very prosperously. They're on a great spit out into the Black Sea. They have a lot of fishing. They have a bunch of subordinate city-states that are paying them tax revenue, maybe on the model of the way the Athenian Empire ran, and they're stamping their own currency. It's beautiful. It's got an eagle catching a fish, and it seems to be on one side, and the other side is a nymph, the residential nymph of the area. As people have written about who is this nymph and why is she on the coin, which is a little irrelevant, but it's a stable symbol. And during this time, I don't know much numismatics. I don't know how precisely these dates can be depended on, but during this time, there seems to be very short intervals, maybe 2 or 3 years of changing letters that are also on the currency. And these are interpreted as magistrates in the city-state, in a democratic Athens-like city-state, who are somehow the minters of the coins. And so their authorization seems to be linked with the value, the civic value assigned. And it seems to be very democratic. And Sinope is prosperous, collecting taxes from their surrounding towns, which are also Greek, and those towns are also using the Sinopean coinage. In 375, there's a peace of some kind with the Persians. I forget what the name of the peace is, or who is involved, or why there's a peace. But then after 375, they install a Persian satrap, and he rules from 375 to 362 when he dies. When he starts, he retains the famous Sinopean coinage, but it is debased. And I think that means, so there is an answer to this because we have the coins. And I think that means the stamping is not as pretty, but he retains the coin. It could be that the metal is debased. And this bears, I think, a clear answer that I will find. And then but the stamping of the minters or the bankers ends. So Diogenes' father is allegedly a banker, and the name Hicasius, as I've said. In 362, the satrap dies, and some other, I don't know what kind of Persian form takes over, but we kind of get more, the coinage gets debased again, and the mint is further away, so it's no longer as local, and the coinage gets debased again. So there's 2 ruptures in the history of the Sinopean coinage. After the second rupture, after the death of the satrap, we have real coins existing that have been like scratched through, like destroyed. Somehow the value is negated, like they're put out of circulation whatsoever. So people have, in the story of Diogenes of Sinope, people have used that, and the name hic, the initials hic are on, or ick, without, you don't write H's in Greek, but ick, are on some of those coins that have been debased. So back in the 1920s, someone decided that it was that coinage debasing post 362 that was the root of the Diogenes story, and therefore Diogenes is much younger than we thought he was, and he never met Antisthenes in Athens because Antisthenes died in 365. So that's the way that story has been used in Diogenes of Sinope stuff. Now I think that it's much more likely. Again, and it has been argued by people who want to retain this link, this teacher-pupil link, that it's the 375 changeover that makes much more sense as the time when Diogenes of Sinope got into trouble. When the Greek regime ends, the Greek sovereignty ends, and the Persians take over. Why would you want to deface the currency when your satrap dies? Anyway, Diogenes of Sinope becomes famously Athenian in his temperament and democratic and challenging to power that's not justified. So it seems to me that he's going to hate the coming of the Persians, and that 375 date is the time that this story arises. And it doesn't need to be associated at all with the coins we happen to have that have an IK on them, because that name, those initials, those could be the beginning of many names, and it would be very unlikely that Diogenes' father was actually on the coins we have. So anyway, the upshot for this article would be to ask, why is he associated? What does he want to do with debasing the currency? And I would say rejecting the new political authority, and that's the point of the story. I don't think we have a current compelling account of why he would debase the currency, except just because he's a negative, destructive guy. That's sort of, he likes to destroy culture. That's sort of what people often say about the Cynics. He's just against anything. And I don't think that's quite true. I think he's really for reason and for individual autonomy in a very Greek way. But he's got a much different delivery system, but I don't think his message is that different from Socrates. So that's that substantial section. We can come back to questions maybe at the end of all three. And put this together. Go ahead.
I just want to comment on the terminology.
Yes.
What you're describing is an act of vandalism as a form of political protest.
Yeah, I guess so. Whatever. So we don't. The vandalism is attested in the coins post 362. So vandalism in 375. I guess we don't document that in the coin heritage, but presumably that's what para-karatein would have meant, to question the authority of the coin stamper.
That's not the same as debasement.
Debasement
is the act by a sovereign.
But we don't know if para-karatein means debasement, right? It means restamp.
You're using the word debasement to refer to what, in my eyes, is something different. Debasement means that the monarch wants to gain something by reducing the purity standard of the coin. He replaces the coin that has, let's say, 80% silver content, replaces it with 70% silver content, and he might declare that it's the same value anyway.
So the banker might do this. Is that what you're alleging?
The monarch is the one.
So Diogenes is not the monarch. He's against the monarch.
Exactly.
But the story is that so debase. I guess I shouldn't say debase. Para-karatein, whatever that means. That's what he's.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really
change the currency.
It's a very important point,
I didn't.
and it's absolutely central to the whole thing.
It is, and I didn't mean debase.
But the word para-karasein, the word karasein means, in this context, a stamp, and a character, which is our word character, is the stamp on the coin. So to karasein is to stamp. Now the word para, as in our word parallel, means alongside, right? So that's even more reason to suppose that this isn't debasement. Para-karasein doesn't mean debasement, it means to give it a new stamp which is different from or alongside the official one.
Right.
Surely that's what it must mean. But that then has all sorts of implications for what the motive for this is. I mean, you said the motive is a kind of vandalism, a kind of being against everything. But the word is nomisma, para-karasein to nomisma, which means to, however you try, you've got a problem, I agree, because how do you translate para-karasein? I mean, there's no translation of it. So you choose debasement.
I think I say restamp in my.
But even restamp doesn't get it all, because the word para means the stamp that you're giving it
Alternative.
is a sort of, yes, something like an alternative alongside the official one. But this then becomes really important, because nomisma, the word nomisma, is from the, which is a normal word for coinage, currency, is from the verb nomisto, which means I think or I practice. So a nomisma is something that you think or you practice, right? And that's what coinage is. There's a joke in Aristophanes' Clouds in which Socrates says about the gods, oh, the gods are not nomisma with us, meaning currency with us. So he's saying, by the way, these gods, because he's an advanced philosopher, doesn't believe in the gods, we don't have these gods as nomisma. And the answer comes, well, who do you swear by then? You swear by Byzantine iron coins. It's an elaborate joke, which is based on the idea that coins are arbitrary, right? Which is what Aristotle says. They're arbitrary. It's just a matter of nomos and nomisto. If you choose to recognize them, then there'll be coins. But Socrates is saying in the Clouds, well, we don't choose to recognize these gods. It's like not recognizing coins. It's quite similar to what Diogenes is saying, in a sense.
Sure.
And so Diogenes is I mean, this relates, of course, to the whole intellectual climate, because nomos and phusis is this great antithesis, as you know, in the 5th century. And the rejection of nomos is not confined, of course, to the Cynics. Nomos is merely arbitrary. Well, you should base your conduct on phusis, as you know. I mean, there's a well-known debate to which many philosophers contribute. So it seems to me Diogenes is making a much more subtle point than just simply rejecting stuff. He's pointing to the arbitrariness of coinage as not exactly a metaphor, but an instance of the arbitrariness of nomos generally. And that's based on the close connection between the word nomos and the word nomisma.
Sure.
So I don't know whether many people already argued this, but that seems to be.
The metaphorical use of para karasin comes back to just change the norms, the behavior. Comes back several times in Diogenes' Laertius' lore, and one of the explanations for why he restamped the currency has nothing to do with coins. It's purely the Oracle of Delphi. He asked the Oracle of Delphi how he should become famous, and the Oracle of Delphi said restamp the nomos.
Yes,
it has nothing to do with coins. It's just norms.
So long as norms is taken to mean something like arbitrary norms.
Right. So we'll come to arbitrariness when we get to the knucklebone coins.
I have a question on this. Would you rather now or at the
Go ahead now.
So I don't know very much about this stuff, but there's a paper on Aristotle and Money by Stefan Eich that's coming out in his book that will be released like now. That one of the main things that Stefan does is point out in Aristotle the differences between the times when he uses nomisma, which happens in the Politics, and when he uses kremata, is that the word for points? Which happens in, no, I got it mixed up. Nomisma happens in book 5 of the Ethics. It's the kremata happens in book 1 of the Politics. And he uses this to suggest that Aristotle is talking about 2 different things at 2 different times. In the one case, the physical money stuff. In the other case, the political thing that you want to point to. And so I say that all by way of saying, do we see this distinction? And you're drawing this from Diogenes' Laertes, right? Would he have used the word nomisma to point to the political thing that you want to argue is going on, deliberately eschewing using kremata, if you wanted to say something more specifically about money? So I'm trying to offer this as like a way to like give you some more evidence for your thesis.
So there's nothing about politics in Diogenes' Laertius, and in fact, someone who's written the most recent book on Diogenes of Sinope's Politeia doesn't think he's political at all. Thinks he's only for individual sovereignty. So I'm adding but there is other scholarship to Citizen Diogenes about how Diogenes is like pushing, like he's presenting a parody of how to be a citizen. Mm-hmm. So I like that side of things, but there's no politics in in Diogenes Laertius. I'm supplying that from this whole argument about when did Diogenes restamp the currency, and since Sinope had famous currency with these two ruptures, it does make sense there's some historicity to the story, and his father's allegedly a banker. So that kind of helps the idea that he was really interested in money. So that's a whole question in itself, right? The money could just be a metaphor throughout all of it, as it is in some versions of the story.
And what's the word for currency there?
Nomism.
It is, okay.
What happens after 362? The Greeks, the Persians lose their control?
Eventually Alexander Philip and Macedonians reintegrated the Greek world.
If he were critic of the satrap, why would he stay in exile? When after 362, wouldn't he be allowed to return? And
at that point, he was probably so ingrained with his life in Athens and so famous that he didn't want to go back. I mean, people chided him for his exile and said that he was condemned to exile, and he said, "I condemn them to stay." One of his famous quips. So Athens was better, and obviously he had a bigger audience for what he wanted to do, and hooked into the Socratic tradition there. So I think he was fairly young when he came to Athens, 25. So phase part 2 of the substance here, we have tons of anecdotes, and most of Diogenes Laertius is filled with little give and take with people he met in Athens, trying to scold them that they failed to live up to their human potential. So we have the famous story of Diogenes of Sinope walking around with a lamp looking for the real human. And there are many alleged humans, but hardly anyone who's really an actualized human being. And to be a human being, you have to maximize, you have to be like Socrates, or maybe I think Diogenes thought he was a model of the perfect human being. You have to be independent of material goods and able to live on your wits and your rationality, your logos. So I'd like to make a couple points about all these bits of lore, which are, some of them are hard to even get, some of them are more juicy and long than others. There are lots and lots of these. There are probably 50 or 60 of them if you wanted to count them, and then which ones are the same, that's a whole question in itself, right? Because we have duplicates of them and copycat anecdotes. But in a bunch of them, say 8 anecdotes, 10 anecdotes, begging is involved. And he proclaims that the world is upside down because things of no value, like gold, are traded for things of much value. He asks interlocutors for money, he never asks. He only out of the 6 anecdotes that I'm taking as my set, he only once asks an interlocutor for food. It's always for money. So it's Plato he asks for food, and he asks Plato for some figs, and Plato gives him a whole barrel of figs. And he says, I forget exactly what he says. I should have had a handout so I could put exactly what he says, but he says, I asked for some figs, not for a dump of your garbage or something like that. Because Plato is failing to recognize, he's being way too generous. He's not recognizing the transaction, which is that Diogenes has no other sustenance than to share with his friends. So friends share all things in common. That's sort of the basis of the Cynic, claiming a share of the financial goods of others, while keeping his own time spare from revenue generating activities, or being a subordinate to someone who could support him. So Diogenes of Sinope has no family. He would have to attach himself to a family to be, or start an industry. So the medics of Athens famously are the weapons manufacturers, the bankers, the musical instrument makers. So there's many industries that come up in Pericles and Athens where the medics are economic makers, but that would take time, and that would be a certain kind of menial life. So he's free from that, but he also doesn't want to attach himself to a household. There are some stories that he becomes a tutor. He gets sold as a slave to a guy named Zetiades in Corinth and becomes a tutor to his sons. And that's a distinct set of anecdotes that most people don't take as the core of who he was. But I kind of think maybe that is how he really lived. But that's kind of beside the point here, because the anecdotes we're talking about are these transactional anecdotes in Athens, where he lives in a barrel. He walks in the snow to accustom himself to cold. He sits in the sun in the summer to accustom himself to heat, and he's tolerant of. He doesn't really need shelter. He doesn't really need income because he shares with his friends on a transactional basis. But the transactions never involve asking for money or for food, except for this one episode with Plato, where the point is to show that Plato doesn't get it at all. But they all ask for money. Most of them ask for money. And in several cases, the point is not so much for him to get the money, but for him to make the point with his interlocutors that they should be thought that they either need to contribute what they're worth, or they need to be less miserly, or they need to care less. Their actions need to match their words. So he criticizes many people for being hypocrites in attacking money, but then getting as much as they can get. So he's trying to teach everybody through his bold courage to live without money, to use their money correctly. So in one set of anecdotes, he asks somebody for a mina, which is a lot of money, and the guy says, well, why are you asking me for a mina and you're asking that guy for a couple drachma? And he says, because unless I win now, I know I'll never get it out of you again. In another anecdote, he's begging from a statue, and someone asks, why are you begging? This one might be a bit of an outlier, but maybe someone can fit it in. Why are you begging from a statue? He says, I'm practicing getting rejected. In another anecdote, he is at the Olympics, and he asks some people for a lot of money, or he asks some people for money, and then he teaches them his wisdom. And if they're receptive, he asks them for more money. But if they don't respond or listen to him, he goes to someone else. And some people he doesn't ask at all. So that shows to me that he's, in a sense, asking. And a further not anecdote but apophthegma saying is that he's not begging, but he's asking for it back. He's not aitain to beg, but he's apaitain. He's asking for repayment. So that refers to his ongoing behavior of teaching the Athenians that he deserves to be sustained at daily level, not to save anything. That's why he doesn't like all Plato's things, but he wants his daily bread to sustain his teaching. Now, one has to push it a little bit to say this is now what Plato hates about the sophists, and what the aristocratic philosophers reject is teaching for money, because that's exactly what Diogenes is doing. He's teaching for money. He wants to be sustained as a professional teacher, although it's on a subsistence level. So there's much sifting that can be done with all these anecdotes, and there's probably more I didn't catch there, but those are certainly the highlights of what's in Diogenes of Laertius's subset of the anecdotes. So there are a few others, there are a few other versions of what have you. Yes.
And the verbs all indicate that there's a transaction going on, because you might think
it's always one-on-one.
He could be teaching them you could do with less, right? The demonstration is you Athenians don't need all this money. Here, I'll take it away from you and see how you just do fine. So it's not transactional as much as like putting them in a condition where they could live with less. But the verbs definitely suggest that he's asking for payment for the services.
So good, thank you. So it does take a little bit of it would take some arguing to say that it's payment for services. Okay. It's not thorough.
It's not right. Okay.
The main message is you Athenians can live with less, and and you need to support. You don't need to like foster your private wealth. You need to support wisdom and the public mission of Athens.
Okay.
So there's lots and lots of complaints about rich fathers who don't educate their sons correctly, and golden statues that the people the city down the street like their cattle more than their sons because they spend that kind of thing. So that's kind of a standard Socratic message, but Diogenes gives it a more impact by these antics and his sacrifice, his demonstration, his performance of living without anything, a total total dependence, which so the story is that he lived to be 90. Everybody loved him when he died in Corinth. They built a huge monument for him. They competed for which monument where monument would go. So I can't really believe that he literally lived as a beggar with nothing until he was 90. That's why I kind of think he lived in a household, at least, but that's sort of beside the point. The story is, the performance is that he's a street guy who can teach people what's really crucial to being a human being. And what's crucial is to foster so the transactions are often verbal and intellectual and tricky gotcha kind of things with the answers people give with either with their language or with their implications or their self-condemnation of the way they condemn him. Someone accuses him of trying to teach philosophy when he doesn't know anything, and he says back, at least I know what I don't know. That kind of thing. So that's what he's trying to tell people they should spend their time doing, is refining their minds and not collecting wealth. That's the critical message. So since that is teaching and that is Socratic teaching, that can kind of dovetail. But the transactional anecdotes per se aren't necessarily selling teaching, but you can kind of dovetail. Just that's a few of them do that, and then overall that's the message. Anyone else have any questions or pushback, feedback on that whole topic, and we can put it all together at the end.
This is totally tangential, but there's a small part of New Testament scholarship that's trying to read Cynics as the opponents in Philippians, and you've totally convinced me they're probably right. This interest in all things in common, the invocation of the dog language, those are the bad guys in Philippians. They're often read as and they're often read as a Jewish opponents, but the larger financial themes in the letter and what you're saying seem like that. I'm much more convinced by that minority position now. So thank you.
And that would be like wrong.
Yes, exactly.
Can I just ask it sort of curiosity question that suddenly occurs to me? I mean, dogs have a lot of characteristics. They can be wicked, they can be loyal, all sorts of human characteristics. But like other animals, they're not influenced by a $10 bill. No animal is influenced by money. And I've often read that observation about our world. Does that ever occur in the ancient world? If it does, of course, that would be a link between this rejection of money and being a
So dogs don't like money.
Well, dogs, not particularly, any animals don't like money.
No.
They just do what you cannot persuade a dog to do. You can persuade a dog to do loads of stuff with a stick or a voice or that $10 bill just won't do the job.
Delete it.
Yeah, I see.
And it's an observation I've seen in the modern world, but probably doesn't exist in the ancient world. So it's a bit of a red herring. But can't help feeling it's sort of.
So there's one. I'm not sure what to do with this, but since you mentioned compensation payment this morning, there's one little anecdote where someone beats Diogenes and says that's so we can give you 300 drachmas as restoration, and then he says back, he does something else and he says, well, that's so I can give you 300 drachmas. So that might mean I don't care. Like money is not gonna fix the fact that you just beat me.
Yeah.
That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and beating is the sort of thing you might do to a dog.
Yeah.
Can I, Justin, you're appearing huge. Okay.
Yes, hello, hi, I'm here.
You're appearing huge on the screen at the front of the room.
I'm normal sized in real life. That's good to hear.
Shut off his camera.
Thank you for accommodating me in this way, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I explained all the details to Joe, but I'm with you in spirit and intellect now.
And image.
So
Yes.
I think this is a good, I can leave him up there if he wants, like, if you want to ask questions and stuff. I don't know if we would rather not. I didn't want to interrupt presentation.
It's up to him.
Do you have anything so far?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No, I just arrived, so I enjoyed hearing the tail end of your talk about Diogenes, and I'm sorry I missed it.
Just raise your hand if you have something. There's one more part. So the final substantial section would be the lore about his politeia. So he seems to be responding to Plato's Republic. That seems to be so there's a whole discussion of whether it's genuine. I take that as I accept it as genuine, along with the people who have written a book about this book. And he seems to be responding to Plato's Republic. So, but we don't have reports of the whole thing. We don't know the scale of treatments of things. We don't know how long it was at all. But what's reported is that he changes the sexual norms completely, totally free love. So Plato's Republic has these marriage festivals, but it's still regulated, and there's a certain promiscuity insofar as children are alone in families, but it's regulated. Diogenes of Sinope seems to completely unregulate, but with the same idea that you shouldn't mate with somebody who could be your child, and all children are in common and there's no families. Women seem to be empowered parallel to men, and that connects with some, so Diogenes Laertius does not give us this evidence. This evidence is from, as I said, a papyrus fragment from Philodemus. But there are a few quips in Diogenes Laertius that connect with this free love kind of thing. So that's what gets the most volume of report so it's Philodemus' treatment is in the mouth, or it's talking about the Stoic acceptance or not of the politeia as part of their heritage, and they don't want to accept it. So they're trying to scathingly characterize it as scandalous. So that there's a lot of discussion of the scandalous sexual stuff. And then there's one line saying, and he said that knuckle bones should be currency. So that's all we have to go on. It seems to come through Chrysippus. Chrysippus the Stoic seems to cite it in under numerous titles. So Chrysippus likes this. I guess there's no military either. That's the third thing that gets cited through Chrysippus. The word knucklebone is a game. So literally it's referring to parts of an animal that were used ever since Homer as a game. Now, they were like rolling dice. So Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon refer to knucklebones as almost as ways of counting. So the idea of, so Plato says if you have 4 knuckle bones times 3 is not the same as 6 times 2. This is in the Theaetetus somewhere. And knuckle bones, that's where he's trying to ask whether the essence of a thing changes when you have different analyses of the thing. And so knuckle bones are the example for numbers, and they seem to want to connote there, and in other such examples in Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, some kind of like rigorous reckoning basis to a game. So that would be a good reason to use, if you wanted to have an alternative to metal-based coinage and have just arbitrary coinage, there seems to be a heritage there in picking knuckle bones. And maybe that's what he has up his sleeve. He wants to, so that would be a positive acceptance that the world is monetized, which does seem to be implied in these many anecdotes of begging for money that aren't begging for food, but they're begging for money. But he's accepting the world's monetized, but we want to change how it's monetized. So that would maybe be consistent with para karatein as stamped in a different system, and get rid of the luxury goods that can be accumulated and maybe hoarded for things that aren't money. Let's just keep money, and it's just arbitrary. It's just money. You can't use it for statues. Another element that I don't know whether is there or not is the idea that the chance is associated with knucklebones. So I don't know if Richard or anyone else happens to know whether knucklebone games include chance. So they did have 4 sides. So there are other pestaloid that have 6 sides that you roll, but knucklebones have 4 sides. So since there are 4 different sides, that does imply that the games you play with knucklebones involve chance.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Divination.
That's what I've always heard.
For sure. Okay. So the idea of money being a fiction and depending not so much on deserving to have it, but happening to have it could be implied in Knucklebones. And then the mere idea that it's all a game, because Knucklebones are surely a game and money is a game, and it's purely a fictional level in society that we don't really need at all, could be an interpretation. And that's the interpretation that the idea that it's just a game and we're just renouncing currency and essentially getting rid of it is the only published developed interpretation I've found in this book on Diogenes Politea. But I don't like that. I want it to mean something more. Now, this book rejects the idea that Diogenes is intuiting fiduciary currency or paper money, because that's anachronistic. It doesn't fit into 4th century culture, and that's all the footnote says. And some Italian scholar argued this at length. Again, I don't think against anybody, but just argued that it can't be fiduciary money. Because it's anachronistic. Now, I'd very much like to reject that interpretation, but I need some reasons so we know that Aristotle doesn't like. I guess we might hear more about isn't there a famous passage of Aristotle where he complains about people who say money is merely conventional, because it has a real value. That was in some of the many books, Sita von Raden and the other books on Greek money that I quickly read last week. First chapters of references some passage in Aristotle that says this, but they pass right by and say Aristotle quickly turns the other way and rejects the idea that money can have no real value, conventional value only, because the Greeks are beholden to money having real metal-based value. That seems to be end of story, but I think this is a case where Diogenes is really questioning the metal-based value of money and really proposing a convention, and I'd like to argue that in this book. Jennifer and then Richard.
I don't know if this happens that early, but like, I mean, you use sheep bones for dice oracles, so for divination practice. So like as a primary way of like, but thinking about the future, trying to help determine the future while also acknowledging the futility of getting towards the future. So I don't know if that's also an earlier practice, if that would also be a helpful.
So clearly, I think that would be uncontroversial, and then the question is, can it become a generalized currency that's fungible for everything? Yeah,
and it could also be then like just to kind of, it seems to match in with the larger worldview about like the futility of these things. Like we're casting after something that it like, it's a lot of scholarship in like ancient magic and stuff. It's like, why do people do these things? It's because you're trying to get at this thing that, while also ritually acknowledging you have no control over this thing.
So the chance element.
Exactly, like the chance element plus a little bit of the like systemic thinking that comes from, you know, like thinking about it in terms of fate, future. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of propose a new way of thinking about this, which is this, that it may seem counterintuitive, but I think there's more to it than may at first appear. There is a remarkable similarity between monetized commerce and a board game, or any kind of game. And that is that in a game, you have two people entirely opposed to each other who are conducting an interaction according to set rules. Heraclitus describes time in terms of a board game. Pursuant, chronos, time is a board game. I argued endlessly that Heraclitus' cosmology is a reflection of this new monetized world. And I would include that passage in my analysis. Why else would you describe time as a board game? Heraclitus is famous for the unity of opposites, which work according to a logos. And that unity of opposites, I've come to realize, is precisely this historically unprecedented but universal phenomenon of two people being locked into peaceful opposition in the commercial transaction. We take that for granted, but that was new in the 6th century BC. And I think with Heraclitus, the board game is an expression of that. Time is like a board game because that's how he envisages the whole cosmic process as a series of commercial interchanges. So time is a board game, a boy playing a board game. because the game, and just to emphasize or repeat the point, is rule-based absolute conflict between two people who are trying to do down the opponent, get as much as they can for themselves. That's a strange idea. You wouldn't find that idea in Homer, in a pre-monetary society. We just take it for granted. Every commercial transaction is this sort of zero-sum game. Zero-sum game, yes. So I think that's certainly the case with Heraclitus. Of course, I'm less confident about Diogenes saying, you would have to say something like, well, rather than having the commerce with money, you might as well have a board game, right? So that it would be a way of reflecting on the nature of commerce by saying, let's just replace it with these mere tokens. Anyway, that's just a faint possibility. And it is counterintuitive.
So what about the anachronism? So this is where I sort of started, that in some ways we're isolated a little bit from anachronism because Diogenes of Sinope is so wild that almost anything goes. But I guess, so the fact that it looks anachronistic because nobody later acknowledges this idea, sometimes in some sense doesn't matter. But I mean, Chrysippus, I guess, liked it enough to report it, but it's not. Why is it anachronistic in 4th century culture to say that there's just a conventional currency? I mean, Aristotle says that people he doesn't agree with the people who say that. So people are saying that.
I mean, it's all this stuff about nominalism there being arbitrary, as I was saying earlier. That's
not. So the idea that it's anachronistic is just someone conveniently getting rid of it from the argument.
Sorry, your problem is whether the idea that money is merely conventional and therefore a kind of nothing is available in the lifetime of Diogenes. It clearly is.
Yeah.
You know, it's there in Aristophanes. It's there in Aristotle, of course, who maybe is probably later than Diogenes, or maybe. Anyway,
I think I think Diogenes overlapped with it completely and died a little later.
Okay. So it could easily have been. But Aristotle is absolutely a central idea.
Right.
And this stuff about Midas, that Aristotle talks about Midas, is an example of how money is useless, because he couldn't eat his food.
So there's Midas.
There's Midas in Antisthenes.
There's Midas and
According to
Diogenes.
you, is the teacher of Diogenes. Yeah. So absolutely, the idea of money as being empty, nothingness, is available to him. It's not an anachronism at all.
But so is that the meaning of the knuckle bones, or is that money is nothing, or is that we're going to use money but it doesn't need to have a metallic value?
Well, I would say that using knuckle bones is a way of exposing the attachment to silver. You might as well use knuckle bones. That's because we are aware of the arbitrary.
So he doesn't need to be serious.
And I would add, it's overdetermined, because I would add my other explanation that the knuckle bones are part of a game, just as money is part of something which is very like a game.
And would there be any reason to think that knuckle bones might have been used on reckoning boards, as counters on reckoning boards? The passage from Plato sounds a little bit like they might have been.
So I read several of the passages on knuckle bones in the 4th century philosophers, and I didn't write them all down. I was in a hurry, so I think it does. I think there are, like, an abacus or something.
Yeah, I mean, particularly if it is in fact the case that his father was a banker, and that would be sort of his initial encounter with money would be as numbers and reckoning. He might have thought of his father of manipulating knuckle bones on a reckoning board to keep track of deposits and withdrawals and loans, and to reduce money to the abstract reckoning rather than to the metallic token. I'll talk a little bit about this in my own paper. The interplay between money and the exchequer is something that in medieval and early modern culture, particularly in France, gets played up quite a bit. So it's certainly something that occurs to people who deal with those things.
I think I was going to go the same way, if picking up on the idea that one of the uses for these knuckle bones is for counting. If it's for counting, an animating idea behind the credit theory of money is that the unit of account function is the most important function, but then how you keep track of who's got debts and who's got credits, well, you can divvy up some objects, or you can just keep a giant ledger, right? And so if these are counters, I could just be pointing to, this is the important thing about money, is keeping track of the count of who's got what. It's not, again, the material reality of the silver or whatever. Yeah. So it dovetails nicely with the credit theory as being the alternative to what became the orthodox commodity theory of money.
So I would want to add that this using money as currency is not just about transactions, but it's about lending and saving, which is plausible if the father was a banker.
And that the real, what's really going on with money is who owes what to whom, and you can keep track of that multiple ways. But it's the counting, the genus is counting, and the species is, do we do it on a ledger? Do we distribute tokens? Do we do something else, right? Pointing to the counting is the real important thing. And an abacus is a really nice kind of physical representation of what that counting can look like in 3 dimensions.
That's what's great about this imagery. It's like, it's all the things we've said. Like, that's what's great about picking knuckle bones with the imagery. It lets you have these big cosmic theological reckonings. It lets you make commentary on the emergence of currency. It lets you say something about value and exchange. It actually is a lot like coins. It just isn't coins.
So it's a good way to like have the climax of the chapter.
Yeah, I think the reason we have so much cool conversation about the knuckle bones is because the image fits all of those things and can be movable in that way. And I think trying to reduce it to like, oh, this is what the knuckle bones reference really means.
And we can't answer that.
Yeah, we couldn't answer it anyway, but I think the range of possibilities would have been accessible to the people who are hearing that. They might have heard, some might have heard one of them, others might have heard something else, yeah.
And we would presume that the full Politeia said more.
Yes.
Although we have just no idea what the fabric of his work would have looked like, whether it was like literally an implication or whether it was like prosaic and yeah.
Is he the kind of person who would put out something and say, everybody make of it what you want to make of it? Or is he the kind of person who has very strong ideas about what he wants to say and what criticism of
certainly his quips are the former. Here's what I'm saying, it means many things. Whatever you think it means says a lot about you. I think, yeah. And regarding Heraclitus, I think Antisthenes, so there's this Antisthenes exegete of Heraclitus who gets his own page and deals cramps because there's one sentence about it, Diogenes Laertius, no other evidence for the guy. I think
Which guy?
Antisthenes, the exegete of Heraclitus.
Oh, okay.
So I think that was our Socratic Antisthenes.
Yeah.
And so if he liked Heraclitus, I could point that out to Heraclitus too. So, and I think that all things are traded for things of no value. I think that can be easily compared just in its structure with the thing of Heraclitus about fire and gold.
Yeah, and it might be a link between pre-Socratic philosophy and Antisthenes' monotheism.
Yeah, I think Antisthenes was a fan. He wasn't a follower of anybody. Who would have been a critic or interlocutor of fan of Heraclitus.
Yeah, so. The only true Greek monotheist in the pre-Christian era, Antisthenes.
So that's my paper, and I think we're a little over time, or around, just about on time. So why don't we do this?